So I've recently been working on this big Monogatari video, and as I've been rewatching the whole series over and over again, I thought it would be appropriate for me to actually finally go ahead and read the light novels that haven't been adapted to animation yet, assuming they ever will be. Just in case there's anything of interest to me in there and of relevance to my video. But after reading the first arc of Off-Season, which is the second to last season we have so far, and the first of the seasons that haven't been adapted yet, I realised that I had plenty of notes, most of which I'm sure will not be directly relevant to my video, so I thought it would be fun to do a series of podcasts where I kind of casually discuss the arcs and record the various observations and insights I might have as I make my way through these books. The first of which is called Oroka Monogatari, which is a play on Orokamono, which means idiot or fool, and this book is composed of 3 arcs: Sodachi Fiasco, which we'll be talking about today, Suruga Bonehead, and Tsukihi Undo. I realise that many of you probably haven't read these arcs. I'll leave a link in the description to the translations that have been done. But I wouldn't worry too much about this. If you're looking forward to watching the anime adaptations eventually, if they do get made, I wouldn't worry too much about this ruining your experience of the anime, because the experience of reading the light novels and watching the anime is very different, and I don't think the plot points are really, that important. I think you can very much enjoy an arc of Monogatari even if you know how it gets resolved. Now, I was surprised to find that I was somewhat astonished by this first arc, which is fairly, as you'll see, fairly uneventful in terms of plot, and definitely very minor in terms of relevance to the overall story of Monogatari. But as we'll see when we get into it, that is kind of the point of the story. It's obviously the first Sodachi POV chapter that we've gotten after her 3 arcs in Owari Monogatari, the first 3 of that season actually, which were Ogi Formula, where we get that flashback that tells the story of that whole quote-unquote trial that the students had in Araragi's class in the first year of high school, where they voted on who they thought had given the study group the answers to the upcoming test. And the whole class votes for Sodachi, even though it obviously wasn't her, and she was the one who organised this whole trial to begin with, but they just vote for her to just get it over with. The second arc was Sodachi Riddle, where we go even further back into the past and see Araragi's meetings with Sodachi in her house, where she teaches him math. And then the third arc was Sodachi Lost, which builds to the final confrontation between Araragi and Sodachi, where the whole story is kind of resolved. And at this point, Sodachi just leaves the series. She's the first of the girls that Araragi deals with in Monogatari to just leave the story when her arc is completed, and she's also the first to remain unaware of the apparitions, the supernatural stuff in the story. She just shows up, is remembered, basically, because most of the drama occurs years before the start of the series, and then she just leaves. That's it. And so here in this arc, told from her point of view, we see what happens at her new high school that she transfers to for the last, I think it's just like the last month of school before the exams. And so I'll give you a brief summary of what happens in Sodachi Fiasco. On her first day at this new school, Sodachi notices that one girl, ironically named Amiko, is isolated from the rest of the class. She attempts to make friends with Amiko, but is repeatedly rejected multiple times throughout the day, and the next day Amiko stops coming to school. Curious as to why this girl is being ostracized by the other classmates, who are seemingly led by this popular girl called Lily, Sodachi eventually discovers that Amiko herself used to be the class leader, so to speak, until one day there was this whole scandal where she got really mad at her close friend Ayakari and started yelling at her and berating her, which resulted in Ayakari herself staying home from school. And Sodachi has not seen this girl Ayakari. She's been absent from the beginning. But witnessing this injustice, the other students led by Lily, who was eager to jump on the occasion to kind of become the new queen bee of the class, they all decide to ostracize Amiko in turn, as punishment for what she did to Ayakari. In the end, Sodachi finds out that Ayakari, the girl who's been not coming to school this whole time, and Lily, the leader of the class, were actually in on this together and mounted some kind of conspiracy to benefit Lily and isolate Amiko. Threatening to reveal what they did, Sodachi gets the girls to reconcile with Amiko, and the next day both Amiko and Ayakari return to school and the balance of the social hierarchy in the class is restored. Except now, Sodachi herself is being ostracized by her classmates because of her strange behavior. And the arc ends with a little twist, well actually a big twist, but we'll get into that later. Now this arc is about 120 pages long, and you might be wondering how that little bit of plot could possibly fill up 120 pages, and the answer to that question is that Sodachi's stream of consciousness musings are really, really dense. Her endless observations and analysis of the various dynamics she finds herself entrenched in, and of course her various speeches about how much she hates Araragi, who of course isn't even in this arc, so that she is presented as being defined by her hatred for Araragi, and we saw this already at the end of Sodachi Lost, when she explains that, hating her parents isn't enough anymore. She has to blame Araragi. She has to use him as she has to make him the villain of her life, or she can't go on living. He has to be the villain. He has to be the scapegoat, basically. And for those of you who don't remember, Sodachi's father was abusive, and one day her dad just disappeared, and then, of course, eventually her mother died after becoming depressed and locking herself in a room and refusing to eat. Given how kind of messed up Sodachi is as a character and how fueled by hatred she is, it's really surprising how much I came to sympathize with her, because her character is surprisingly nuanced. Under all the hatred, under all the negative feelings expressed outwardly, anger, hatred, violence, and all that we saw in the previous arcs she appears in, under all that there's basically this bed, this foundation of self-hatred, this whole inferiority complex, basically. And we realize that she's really riddled with social anxiety, and that's the important first kind of section of this arc, is her arriving in the class. There's a whole scene where she attempts to introduce herself and kind of fumbles her way through the introduction, which of course she's really embarrassed about, and the other students kind of laugh about it. And then of course there's another rejection when she attempts to kind of make friends with Amiko, who just ignores her and literally walks out of the classroom. And then throughout the day she goes up to her again multiple times, and every time Amiko just ignores her, until at the end of the day Amiko takes Sodachi up onto the roof and starts listing information about the other classmates, basically saying, oh, this person's nice, you should go talk to this person. And it basically feels like, or at least Sodachi interprets this as Amiko trying to get rid of her, trying to kind of push her onto someone else, telling her, oh, you should go talk to this person, don't try to get involved with me. And then of course the next day Amiko just stops coming to school. So this first section is really about Sodachi kind of reaching out, trying to open herself up, or trying to make connections, in contrast to her previous behavior that we saw in the previous arcs, where she was just kind of closed in on herself, wallowing in her self-pity and her feelings of hatred for everyone else, and just being a shut-in, basically, just not going to school, not going outside. So here she's actually trying to make an effort, and even on her way to school in the first chapter, she thinks about, trying to make friends. She kind of almost jokingly suggests that she might make friends with everyone in class before the year is over. So there's something really kind of sympathetic and sad about first the embarrassment in front of the entire class when she does her introduction, and then the repeated rejection by this other girl who herself seemed isolated from the rest of the class. And that's why Sodachi actually tried to approach Amiko, because she saw that she was ostracized and thought that she would basically be an easy target, that she would be appreciative of Sodachi making an effort to become friends with her, because surely if she's alone, if she's isolated, this girl is desperate for friends. And what Sodachi realizes when the girl rejects her is that she wasn't considering that there might be a reason why Amiko is isolated. There might be a reason why she's not integrated into the kind of the social dynamics of the rest of the class. Maybe she wants to be isolated, maybe she's isolating herself, or maybe, there's an actual reason why nobody wants to talk to her. And so this first confrontation with the other, with another person who she's reaching out to, first comes from a place of almost desperation, her trying to quickly make friends with someone so as to put an end to this early kind of embarrassment and anxiety. But that attempt is broken by this realization that this other person is an actual person who has their own feelings, their own reasons for behaving the way they're behaving. And to add to the feeling of alienation and isolation that Sodachi is feeling, this takes place in a different province, a different area of Japan where the kids all have these strong accents. They speak in a dialect, and so Sodachi has a really hard time actually understanding what her classmates are saying, which makes this a particularly interesting arc because there's actually not a lot of dialogue. One of the things that the Monogatari series is known for. This arc really takes place almost entirely in Sodachi's mind. The few times there are interactions with other characters, Sodachi remarks on the fact that she can't really understand what they're saying, and so often it's kind of reported back to us through Sodachi. She remembers something a character said, or she just kind of says, yeah, I kind of ignored what this person was telling me, and I didn't really understand it. So there's this real feeling of the reader being enclosed in Sodachi's mind, and us not really having access to other people through dialogue like we usually do in other Monogatari arcs. But another interesting thing with the dialect barrier between Sodachi and her classmates is that at first it's obviously just a barrier. It's something that prevents her from connecting in an easy way with her classmates. But there's something very telling about the way she even thinks about the fact that to them, she's the one who sounds weird, right? Because they all obviously have the same accent, but to them, she's the one with the weird accent. So again, she's kind of turning it back around on herself and thinking about the fact that she's the one who's isolated. She's the one who's different, which of course just hammers home that feeling of isolation. Of course, her encounter with Amiko, this girl who seems isolated from the rest of the class, is a kind of mirroring of her own antisocial behavior in the past. By transposing this behavior onto someone else, she's forced to examine her own selfish attitude and open herself up to understanding someone else, understanding an other. And so there's a kind of ironic inversion there where she's presented with someone who's a bit like herself, and through this confrontation, she will learn to think about others and their own situations, not just her own. So this confrontation with someone who's a bit like her, or at least has a similar situation to her, ironically opens Sodachi up to others, to difference. And she even says in the narration, "As someone who only thinks about herself, I don't have even 1 millisecond to spare for thinking of other people. There was only enough space in my heart to despise that detestable man to the utmost." So obviously we understand that this is going to be an arc about her finding more room in her heart, beyond just hating Araragi, finding room for other people. But what happens next in the arc is really interesting. After Amiko stops coming to school, suddenly all of the other classmates start being really nice to Sodachi. They start trying to befriend her, they start talking to her, and in the beginning she jokingly talked about becoming friends with everyone, and now it seems like she even says that it feels like she's entered a parallel world. It's like she's being given everything she could have hoped for, this perfect kind of social life with her classmates. And yet, she's not satisfied with this situation. It doesn't sit right with her. She has this kind of self-destructive urge. She even describes herself as being a contrarian. She's always going against the easy route in her life. The easy route to friendship, to social integration. And what she realizes is that there's something going on in this class. Obviously, there's something weird going on. And what's going on is basically that there's been this kind of transference of guilt. The class feels guilty about ostracizing Amiko. Because, like I explained earlier, Amiko ostracized Ayakari, and so then the class ostracized Amiko because of what she did to Ayakari. But now that Amiko, just like Ayakari, has stopped coming to school, the other classmates kind of feel like they're the bullies, basically. They perpetuated this cycle of victimization that led to another student staying home from school. And so what's happening here is that they're trying to avoid that with Sodachi, or they're trying to buy back some kind of good karma by being nice to Sodachi. And Sodachi figures this out, and she thinks about doing something about this, right? She hears that Amiko goes to this cram school in the evenings, and she considers going to the cram school, confronting Amiko, and, untangling this whole mess. And this is where we get maybe the most important aspect of Sodachi's inferiority complex, I suppose. She says this: "At a time like this, if I were a quote-unquote special person like Hanekawa or Senjo Gahara, of course I'd be able to overcome this situation by myself. But even if I weren't, I could insist on a worthless thought like, if I lose my way, surely a passerby will suddenly appear to guide me to my destination." What she means by special person is talented people, basically. People she's met in the past, like Hanekawa, Senjo Gahara, and to an extent Araragi. People basically who feel like main characters in a story. And this is where we get the inferiority complex, right? Sodachi feels like she's not a main character. She's a side character. She's on the fringe of the main story. She's on the outside of the main story. And she even says, "Even if I'm continuously astonished by the series of unfortunate events visited upon me, I have no intention of acting like a tragic heroine. I don't deny that I have a bad habit of getting drunk off of my own masochism, but at most I consider myself simply a supporting character in someone else's tragedy. I've hardly even been the main character in my own life." And then she says, "I'm like an actor whose turn was over, but I failed to leave the stage. My objections did nothing but bother the playwright." Now, obviously there's a kind of metatextual element to this, which is that, well, it's true, Sodachi isn't really one of the main characters, one of the main girls. Like I said, she shows up in Owari Monogatari, and when her arc is concluded, she just disappears from the story. And she's also the only girl, like I said, who is unaware of the supernatural element of the story. She is on the fringe of the story, she's right. But that's just the story we're being told, right? And now we're being told her story. And in her story, obviously, she is the main character. So this feeling of inferiority, this feeling of being on the margin, on the fringe of an actual main story, of being a supporting character in someone else's tragedy or in someone else's big adventure, is another reflection of her isolation, of her reflexive need to think of herself as being isolated from everyone else, as being unimportant. Now, of course, this whole classroom situation where there are these cycles of victimization and ostracization, ostracization, is that the word? Yeah, of isolation, whatever. Obviously, this whole situation kind of formally reflects the trial situation that we saw in Ogi Formula, where the whole class just decided to scapegoat Sodachi and decide that, well, she's the culprit because they just wanted to put an end to the whole fiasco and go home. And here we have another instance of a kind of scapegoating, right? Not only the class ostracizing Amiko after what she did to Ayakari, but then at the end of the story, there's a beautiful kind of sad irony that occurs when everything wraps up, which is that by kind of restoring the balance of the class, Sodachi herself becomes ostracized, right? There needs to be someone who is scapegoated. There needs to be one person who kind of takes the blame or takes on the negative feelings of the class so that the rest of the class can function properly. And this is the heroic element of Sodachi's arc here, is that she knowingly takes on that burden. Again, like she did unwillingly in that situation with the trial in her first year of high school, she took on the blame there too, but now she's doing it willingly. And the reason she's ostracized, the specific reasons are that at one point she takes one of her classmates, she gets kind of frustrated with not understanding what's going on, and she, just like Amiko took her onto the roof to explain everything to her, she then takes another classmate onto the roof and kind of forces that girl to explain everything to her. And here we get another great illustration of Sodachi's kind of enclosed perspective, where we don't really have these long dialogue scenes where everything's clarified. Instead, we just have everything received through the lens of Sodachi, because in this scene with this other classmate who basically explains what happened between Amiko and Ayakari, and then between the class and Amiko, Sodachi just doesn't really Sodachi doesn't really listen to what she says, and she later narrates that Kyakufuji, the girl, told me the reason for their fight as well, the reason for the fight between Ayakari and Amiko, but since it was just ridiculously insignificant from my perspective, I've decided to leave it out. If I may make a small reference, it was a bit vulgar. So she just leaves out the kind of impetus, the main cause of the whole situation that we're exploring here, the beginning of the mystery that we're exploring here. It's just kind of brushed aside because Sodachi wasn't really paying attention, or the reason for the dispute didn't seem important to her. And of course, it's not really important, right? What matters here is how Sodachi is dealing with this situation. And that's another thing, is that like most Monogatari arcs, this arc, it presents itself as a kind of mystery, right? She arrives on her first day of class, and she notices, well, first she notices that Amiko is kind of isolated from the rest of the group, and then she notices that there's a missing student. There's one chair that's empty, and she looks at the kind of registration, and she sees the name of the student, and she kind of wonders, like, who is this? But she doesn't even know if it's a girl or a boy at first. And so there's this mystery box, right? There's this empty chair. There's obviously some kind of history between the classmates, the reason why they're ostracizing, why they're kind of alienating Amiko. So there is this mystery that's presented. And throughout the arc, there are a few moments of kind of exposition, a few moments where characters reveal things about the class and its history, although, like I said, it's filtered through Sodachi's kind of indifference and her misunderstanding of the dialect and the accent. And I feel like Nishio Ishin here is trying to tell a mystery in the most minimal way possible, with the least amount of, first of all, the least amount of plot developments possible, and then resolving the mystery with the least amounts of information, basically. There aren't any big plot twists or action scenes, really. The whole thing is just resolved through Sodachi's stream of consciousness observations, based on the little pockets of information that are delivered throughout the arc. Which, of course, is appropriate given that this is supposed to be the story of someone who is no longer among the quote-unquote special people. She doesn't feel like a main character. It makes sense that the mystery she becomes involved in would be so mundane and uneventful. right? This is just the mystery of why a student in this particular class became ostracized. It's not a story or a mystery involving supernatural monsters and creatures. This is just an ordinary situation. And yet, Sodachi, despite being a quote-unquote supporting character, she does feel like she's in a mystery. She does feel just like Araragi and other characters whose POVs we've had before. She does feel like she has to do something about this. There's this great scene where basically Sodachi goes to this game center. She's just kind of lonely, and she goes to the game center, and there's this great scene where she looks at the photo booth, and she thinks about the fact that something normal schoolgirls do is, take funny photos in the photo booth and all that, and she considers taking a photo just by herself to remember this moment, but she realizes she doesn't have the money or whatever, and she has to go to the other end of the game center to get money out. And there she sees Lily, the de facto leader of the class, and Ayakari, the originally ostracized girl, together, having fun, laughing. And that's where she realizes that there's some kind of conspiracy going on to isolate Amiko, the previous leader. And she says this: "Why are they trying to pull me into this sordid quagmire? No. Lily and Ayakari aren't trying to pull me into anything. To those girls, I'm simply a supporting character. Setting aside the question of whether it's a tragedy or a comedy, those two had no intention to do anything at all to me." So Sodachi realizes that, no, this has nothing to do with me. They're not trying to hurt me. They're not trying to pull me into their plot, their story, their mystery. And yet she feels like she's pulled into it. She feels like she has to act on what she's witnessing. Out of some kind of sense of justice, she wants to help Amiko, the girl who maybe kind of deserved to be ostracized to some extent for being really mean to her friend Ayakari. But Sodachi still feels like she has to do something about this. And so this is where there's the closest thing we get to kind of an action scene in this arc. This is the climax of the arc. Witnessing, in this game center, witnessing Lily and Ayakari and other classmates just kind of having fun together, she runs up to them. She steals Lily's phone, which presumably contains evidence of this conspiracy, and she then runs out of the game center and hides in a bin. And she's confronted with the phone. She has to enter a password. She eventually figures out what the password is, and then the other kids find her, and she confronts them, and she tells them, if you don't go and make up with Amiko, I'm gonna, do something with all this information in these texts and group chats and all that. She's going to send it to Amiko, she's going to send it to people, and people will find out about what happened. We don't really know the extent of the conspiracy, or what exactly happened, or whether Ayakari really set up this whole thing to kind of fuck over her former friend Amiko. We don't really know what happened. It's kept from it, and in keeping with the whole kind of unreliable narrator thing, we don't get all the information. We only get what's relevant to Sodachi's actions and her development as a character, obviously. And this is where we get what is maybe the most important line of the entire arc, and the line that kind of resolves Sodachi's story to an extent, where Lily, the girl, mad that Sodachi has stolen her phone and that she's kind of blackmailing her in a way, she's like, whose side are you on? For whose sake? Under whose influence? Based on whose value system are you screwing around with me like this? And Sodachi thinks, as she continued relentlessly questioning me in that shrill voice, I got fed up and thought of a suitable answer. And her answer is Araragi. The man she supposedly hates more than anyone else, anything else on Earth, Araragi, is the answer to the question, for whom are you doing this? So we understand here that there's some kind of resolution, right? That Sodachi has come to some kind of realization about herself and possibly her feelings towards Araragi, that she can name him explicitly as the motivator, the influence of her, the kind of inspiration for her actions. Actions done in the name of a justice of a kind, something she never would have done before. Taking action here, trying to resolve this situation, to help out this girl Amiko, who she barely knows and who even, ignored her the first time she tried to speak to her. She's doing this for Araragi. She's doing this in the name of a kind of heroism, basically. And Araragi is the representative of that reaching out to others, that helping others, as opposed to Sodachi's previous behavior, which was closing herself off to others, or being aggressive and angry and hateful and violent toward other people. And now that this kind of emotional resolution, this emotional climax has occurred, we finally get to the twist at the end of this arc. So after this whole situation is resolved, and after Sodachi realizes that, she's not going to get what she wanted, she's not going to make friends, certainly not make friends with the whole class. She's going to basically probably remain isolated throughout the rest of this semester. After all this, one day when she's I think she's just walking to school, she gets a call from the Hakabe couple. The Hakabe couple are the people who are kind of fostering Sodachi in this new town. She gets a call from them, and they tell her that someone has come to see her at the house. And immediately, Sodachi's reaction, and probably the reader's assumption as well, is to think that this is Araragi. She immediately starts asking questions like, is it a boy about my age? Does he look like he's good at maths? She gets kind of excited at the prospect of Araragi coming to visit her, and we can see this as an extension of the fact that she's just recently kind of come to terms with her affection, or at least come to terms with the inspiration that she's gotten from Araragi and what he represents to her. But then the twist is the disappointment that it's not Araragi. In fact, it's not a young man, it's an older man, and he's really drunk, and he's saying that he's Sodachi's father. That's the big twist. That's the big ending of this arc, is that now that Sodachi has resolved, in a way, her feelings towards Araragi, who, like we said, was kind of on the receiving end of Sodachi's transference of her hatred for her parents, and probably specifically her father, who was the kind of tyrannical force in the house. She transferred that hatred onto Araragi. He became the object of her hatred in her own little kind of bit of scapegoating. But now that she's kind of resolved her feelings towards Araragi, what's the best kind of punchline to this? Well, we get the return of the original object of that hatred, the originator of all the negative things in Sodachi's life. But what's really important here is her reaction to this news. And at first she's just kind of disappointed that it's not Araragi, obviously. And all she says is, okay, I understand, I'll head back right now. So she's going to just head back to the house and presumably confront her father. But the last line, which in this English translation is a bit weird, is, after all, even with that, I'm perfectly alright. So meaning, after everything that's happened, everything she's come through, after everything she's been through, she's kind of reached a new level of self-assurance, of confidence. And even with something like this, even with the return of her father, the return of the original object of hatred in her life, I'm perfectly alright. She's fine. She's okay. She can deal with it. She now has the tools to deal with something that monumental, that horrible, the return of an abusive father. And to me, this all just seems so elegantly composed. Throughout this arc, and, well, in the ways it echoes previous arcs, specifically the previous arcs involving Sodachi, of course, there's this interplay of all these different thematic elements. The notion of absence, of isolation, of being ostracized from a group. Obviously, we originally saw that in the trial storyline in Ogi Formula, but it didn't just affect Sodachi. We also find out in that arc that after that whole situation, Araragi became somewhat cynical. He became Araragi himself was very much affected by that situation, because it turned out that the one who had actually given the answers to the upcoming test to the study group was the teacher, who wanted the performance of her students to go up. And the teacher was a part of this whole trial, and she herself voted for Sodachi when they were trying to decide who was the culprit. And Sodachi, seeing that the teacher, who she had figured out was responsible, without hesitation, voted for her. That obviously kind of changed her perspective on things a little bit, and she immediately stopped coming to school, and she only returns to school after that teacher goes away on maternity leave, I think, if I remember correctly. But after this event, it's not just Sodachi who is affected by this. I think Araragi, I'm trying to remember the specific phrasing, but he says something like, this is the story of a guy with no friends realizing that he doesn't need friends, or he doesn't want friends. So Araragi himself was kind of dejected became kind of cynical after this whole situation, and he explicitly says that he stopped coming to school as often. He started skipping classes. So there's this idea of people isolating themselves because of these situations of majority rule, of herd mentality, of scapegoating. But of course, we shouldn't forget the important element, which is that it's an adult that does this. It's an adult. It's the realization that an adult would turn on a student, would scapegoat a student just to protect their own standing. That realization is very, very disheartening, and it connects kind of indirectly, in a kind of roundabout way. It connects to a scene in this arc, another really important scene, which I haven't talked about yet, which is when Sodachi finds out that Amiko, even though Amiko has stopped coming to school, she still goes to cram school in the evening. And Sodachi goes to the cram school, and she makes her way in. Or actually, a small little tangent here, but she realizes that there's security at the entrance of the cram school, and at first she thinks that the security is really tight. They're checking for loads of different things that you're not allowed to take into the cram school, anything that would theoretically distract you from studying. But then she kind of walks around the school and looks for other entrances, and she can't find anything, and she comes back to the entrance and realizes that the security actually isn't that strict, that the security guards aren't really doing a good job of checking. And this kind of theme, or this thread, gets woven into the resolution with the pin code on Lily's phone, where she has to guess the password to this phone, the 4 digits, and she ends up coming to the conclusion that most people aren't very smart with their passwords, and they just use their birth dates. And so she manages to unlock the phone, to bypass the faulty security to unlock the phone, and she bypasses the faulty security of the cram school to get into the cram school. So there's this notion of, again, that kind of reflects her isolation and her feeling of being kind of closed off from other people, but also from something she wants to reach, right? So there's this barrier between her and the thing she wants to attain. In the case of the password of the phone, it's kind of a connection to her classmates, the intimacy and the interpersonal relationships of these people around her. In the case of the cram school, it kind of says something about the adult world and people not doing their job very well, and the kind of faulty infrastructure, the faulty system at play here. But anyway, she gets into the cram school, she meets with Amiko, and Amiko drags her out and takes her to this is it a diner or restaurant or something? Oh yeah, it's a fast food restaurant. She takes her to this fast food restaurant, and there's a TV on the wall, and there's the news is on, and they're kind of talking, but then all of a sudden, Amiko just is like watching the news, and she just says, "Why do they always say the same thing?" You know, she just comments on the fact that these news reporters and people commenting on these important events and situations, they always say the same lines, the same things. And so there's this feeling of kind of a critical stance towards certain social or cultural conventions, right? A certain mentality that people have, where we just kind of not necessarily ignore, but just kind of minimalize problems by saying these ready-made phrases, these expressions and whatnot. And when I, in preparation for this podcast, when I rewatched the Sodachi arcs in Owari Monogatari, there's something that happens at the end of that arc where Araragi is confronting Sodachi, right? And they're talking about everything shitty that's happened in her life, and she goes on this kind of monologue where she minimizes everything that's happened to her. She says, actually I have the line here somewhere. She says, "I'm not that unfortunate. What happened to me could have happened to anyone. Everyone has these experiences to one degree or another. It was a little harder than the average life, but that's just looking for excuses. It was a rare and valuable experience, a kind of learning experience. I can count myself lucky because at least I'm still alive." So she's kind of trotting out these phrases, these ready-made phrases that people say to kind of relativize or justify or minimize things that have happened to them, right? And I think, and maybe this is a commentary on a particular kind of Japanese mentality as well, that's perhaps a bit more than Western societies, perhaps more inclined to not want to engage in self-pity, not want to complain about your situation, just want to kind of fit in. So there's this certain mentality, a certain kind of social convention that's on display in these arcs, right? How things become normalized in society, minimized, explained away, ignored, dismissed. And of course, Amiko is watching the news when she says this, and the news, the media, it's the realm of the adults, it's the realm of the society, the framework within which these kids are growing up, right? So it's connected to the adult world. It's all connected to a kind of failing of the adult world in some respect. And there's a later or an earlier line, I can't remember, that's pretty interesting as well, where Sodachi is thinking about Amiko and what she did to Ayakari and the guilt and that's going around the class and all that. And she says, "It'd be wrong to force an excessively ethical viewpoint onto her and say that she had to feel guilty about anything. It's an ethical viewpoint that a nation ought to have, but it's all but impossible for an individual." So this mention of the nation, right, of the ethical viewpoint of the nation, seems significant to me here, contrasted with the individual who kind of operates on a different logic, right? We can't shoulder that kind of burden, that kind of ethical framework by ourselves. It's a larger societal, cultural framework, viewpoint. And so these stories, I mean all of the stories in Monogatari, but this story specifically, Sodachi's story, while it may seem very psychological, very intimate, very personal, about her sense of isolation, her social anxiety, all these things, with these stories about integrations into social groups, or the ills and the evils of a particular group, the evils that a group can enact on an individual, it becomes a story about the individual's relation to the larger group, and how certain structures, certain ethical structures, structures of guilt, become formed in a group, and how individuals are scapegoated, isolated for their failings inside that group. And it seems clear here that this story represents a cycle of victimization and the guilt that becomes associated with that cycle. Now, obviously, on a larger scale, if we connect these themes to the quote-unquote adult world, the nation, the larger structure at play here, we can see that this becomes a story about cycles of victimization in society, cycles of abuse, domestic abuse in Sodachi's case, but cycles of abuse in history, enacted in the name of an ethical framework, a moral system, a certain mentality, social conventions. And what becomes the counter of that cycle? What resolves that cycle, or what takes on the burden of breaking that cycle? Well, it's Araragi, or at least it's Araragi in name only in this arc. It's Sodachi acting in Araragi's name. So all of these themes, all of these kind of levels or layers of complexity to this narrative, we can take these individual intimate psychological stories and kind of widen the scope to track onto larger societal, political, cultural narratives. All of these elements, these themes of ostracization, isolation, scapegoating, herd mentality, guilt, shared guilt, social conventions, all these things, the failures of the adult world and of infrastructure, all of these things interact in a very elegant way and finally reach this conclusion where Sodachi will be confronted directly with the quote-unquote adult world, right? The originator of the symbolic order in Lacanian terms, the father, right? The father figure. Sodachi is going to have to confront the origin of all that hatred, all those cycles of victimization and abuse in the figure of the father, the real father, not a symbolic father, the symbolic nation or whatever, but an actual father. So it all circles back around to the personal story, the personal history. But this time, Sodachi feels what? She feels like she's capable of dealing with it. And so that's the optimism here, the hope, right? Sure, there's that perfect kind of beautiful irony to the classroom storyline where Sodachi, in reaching out, in deciding that she wants to act on behalf of others, to help others, and to enact a kind of justice, she ends up ostracizing herself, ironically. By reaching out, she ends up isolating herself, but isolating herself this time for quote-unquote positive reasons, right? Before she was isolated for negative reasons, outside of her control, and now she's deciding to isolate herself, ironically, paradoxically, in order to connect with others, or in order to help others, meaning that she is willing to reach out to others. So despite that kind of tragic ending to that storyline, this little twist at the end and Sodachi's kind of final expression, which is one of confidence that she will be able to deal with the situation, is optimistic. And I'm curious to see how her character develops. I think she appears in a later arc. There aren't any more Sodachi POVs, and it's not really clear if Nishio-Ishin has actually ended the series or not. I think at this point people don't really know, so I don't know if there will ever be any more Sodachi arcs in the future if the series does continue, but I don't think we need any. I'm sure if there are more, if Nishio-Ishin decides to write more, he'll find a way to make the situation interesting, maybe find an interesting way to deal with Sodachi's confrontation with her father and whatnot, but we don't really need that, I don't think. I think this arc is perfectly resolved, and I think that's I don't know how long I've been recording for, and this was a very chaotic and rambly and full of tangents and weaving in and out of different themes and different sections of the story. I'm sure there's plenty of things I forgot to mention, but I think this is pretty much all I have to say about this arc. But this is basically what's going to happen over the course of the coming weeks, I think, as I work on my Monogatari video. I don't know when that'll be out, but I'll keep these podcasts coming maybe every week or so. We'll see how it goes. So yeah, I'll see you in the next episode.